Thank you, Zara, for the introduction. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to come back and present you part of the new research, which is very much a continuation of the talk, last talk I gave at Work in Progress, but it is still work in progress. So a lot of ideas and concept that definitely can be developed. So just to recap a little bit, I see this part of the research as a continuation on the work on transcendence, that is to say the definition of transcendence as a realm, locus of power that has a specific structure across societies. So one goal of the book is to actually understand better how it works. The other goal would be actually to dismantle it, to let it collapse from within, however, not by simply dismissing it as something that is false. Last talk on René Girard was actually on the functioning of transcendence. With Emanuele Severino, I used Emanuele Severino as a tool to make some progress into the deconstructive part of the argument, where I want to let transcendence implode on itself. Who is Emanuele Severino? Just briefly, for those of you who don't know him, born in Brescia in 1929, he died recently in 2020. A very important Italian philosopher. Not a lot has been translated in English. His most important work, though, has been translated, The Essence of Nihilism. He was a student of Gustavo Bontadini. So he comes from a school called New Scholastic Thought that emerged in the 20th century. However, if it's starting was in the New Scholastic current, he rapidly gained a reputation as an unorthodox thinker, and that got him into trouble. In the 1960s, he was an assistant professor, if I believe, or associate, I don't remember it well, but he was teaching at the Catholic University in Milan, a very prestigious private institution, and at that time he was also condemned as an heretic by the Vatican, and so he lost the job and had to find another university. Anyway, he's a very complicated, interesting thinker. I'm not going to give you a full illustration of his philosophy. It would be impossible. I just want to concentrate on a few elements that will help me, hopefully will help me tackle the problem of transcendence, okay? Particularly the problem of transcendence in temporal terms, in terms of time, okay? What do I mean by that? I think it is easier to understand transcendent as a space that exists in a specific dimension in spatial terms, that is to say, as a place that is beyond, right? You can imagine it as something that is beyond our normal worldly life. So you can understand it as a sort of border, as something that lives beyond the border, and it's probably also easier to dismantle transcendence by saying that you just imagine a space that is infinite, right? It would go on forever, so there's no need for an outside, for an external dimension. It is harder instead to think in temporal terms, in these terms, right? We are living beings that are taught and live through a very rigid progression of time, where you have, birth, growth, decay. Usually the arrow of time is implacable, right? There's a beginning and there's an end. But these beginnings and ends are, again, points of transcendence for time. What is there before the beginning of time? What originates time? You can see that already that point would create an exception that somehow founds the very system that is in contradiction with or is opposed to. And it could, and you can also think about the end of time, right? What's going to happen at the end of time, right? So how do you come to terms with those externalities of time? How do you avoid the trap of a temporal transcendence? That's a little bit the goal for me today. I hope I'll have enough time, and I'll go through Severino's philosophy by looking at two major concepts that he developed. One is, just to anticipate, the nihilism of Western civilization, and then the other is the idea of eternity as appearing. So one way to avoid the externalities of time would be to think at an eternal dimension where everything keeps on existing. But it's not, we'll see that it's also, that is difficult to think. So let's get started. I will draw from different sources by Severino, but to give you a general feel of his discourse, Severino is his point of departure is the issue of death and pain. Death and pain are what humankind fears the most, and that's what they produce a remedy. They produce some form of action, some form of language, something that will fend off, that will have to fend off death and decay. Again, death as an externality will be the end of the present time for the individual. And these remedies are usually, he calls them discourses, great discourses of Western civilization. And there are three of them. The first is the myth, the second is philosophy, and the third, which we currently live in, is technology or techne. Let's begin with myth. Okay, what happens in ancient myths? Now, this periodization is very peculiar, and I will let you know a little bit that it doesn't really follow regular historical accounts of how humanity developed. So I will just make sure I'll point that out as I go along. So let's go back to the idea of dying, right? And what happens when somebody dies? So Severino writes, for primitive people grew accustomed, of course, to something that is built into humanity and animal life in general, right? Death. And he says, by becoming other, man keeps on dying because it's not the same as that person was before. First, by becoming other, all stages of life disappear, and then he also dies and leaves behind lives completely. He becomes, therefore, other in a different way. He's not other from what he was before, but he becomes other in an absolute way. He turns into a corpse, he says. Primitive people find a way to coexist with the defunct by considering it another mode of being alive. To those who survived, the corpse has the appearance of that which has been subtracted from the visible. So the issue that Severino is confronting here is that for primitive people, there was no real death as non-being because people persisted. They persisted in the form of specters or spirits, right? There was a permanence of their being that did not cease to exist. It was only a matter of visibility. They disappeared from the regular world and they're somewhere else, and spirits were dangerous too, so you get to appease them, right? Some of the evidence that he produces, and you can see here, is very primitive. He's talking about Greek myths, for instance, the myth of Kronos. Kronos as the father of all gods, that it is true, eats his children, but does not annihilate them. He vomits them back into the world. So they, in a way, they keep on living. The other example he gives is the Genesis itself. What is the Genesis? It's the story of humankind, again, coming to grips with death and deciding that actually the natural forces that these primitive people saw in nature were actually something that could be mastered by humans themselves, replacing nature or God, a divine force that would rule the world. Why does he say that Adam and Eve attempts to replace God? Well, because in the Genesis, of course, you have the moment in which the apple is eaten, right? And if you eat the apple, the snake tells Adam, you will become God. Eritis sicut Deus. Okay, so you will become God. You will become God, and somehow you will defeat death. Now, this, of course, fails, according to Severino, and after being hunted down from paradise, Adam's Eve and humans somehow find a way not to replace God, but to strike an alliance with God. And here would be the point of departure for what I've said regarding Girard. You establish a religion based on a compromise, on some sort of contract, according to which God will save you, God will protect you. That is to say, transcendence will protect you, right? As long as you do certain things, so as long as you behave in a certain way. So this is the alliance. But again, Severino is making the point that all these beliefs are based on the idea of an endurance, on a permanence of life, right? It's a permanence of life that will come in the afterlife, right? So the divine beyond transcendence turns in a kind of substance that guarantees permanence according to this contract, to the alliance, and so some sort of relief for the belaboring human being. Now, this let's see. Yeah, I go back to the issue of how Christianism, however, is a little different from earlier myths. But I just want to reiterate the point that according to Severino, in the age of myth, transcendence becomes the guarantee for permanence. Okay. Now, when you have instead the emergence of the new era, that is to say, philosophy, you have the emergence of a doubt regarding the real effectiveness and the truthfulness of myth, the capacity really to preserve people from dying in a way. Of course, people would still die, but Severino says, look, you would still die, but when you die, the problem is how you conceive of death. If you believe there's something afterwards, you're going to die in a different way than if you believe in nothing. So that's what it means by the permanence of life. However, with philosophy, the doubt emerges that this belief is not really truthful. That this discourse cannot really protect from suffering, anguish, and death. Philosophy is thus the moment in which culture, instead of being afraid of this transformation, embraces this transformation. Instead of being afraid of the becoming, which means being other from yourself and then ultimately being other completely from what you were and I, philosophy is the moment in which becoming turns into something affirmative. Again, in a very idiosyncratic translation of Aeschylus, particularly the hymn to Zeus in the first tragedy of the Oresteia, Severino translates into Italian a sentence in which he has Aeschylus say, you need to think that a truth only is the supreme remedy against suffering, anguish, and death. I checked the other translations. It's not, I don't know Greek, but it's not the common translation. In in any way, anyway, the issue is the Greek thought now discovers the truth of nihilism. That is to say that becoming is a constant transformation that has at its core nothingness, the production of nothingness. Severino says, the being of the world issue from and return to nothing, passing from their nothingness to being a not nothing and vice versa. The supreme evidence of Western civilization consists in the purest and most abysmal alienation, the conviction that being is nothing, that we pass from a notherness to a notherness that eventually would lead to nothingness. When he says that that philosophy understands the problem of nothingness and he sort of mobilizes it, is he's also including Christianity in this, right? He said, Christianism is part of Greek thought. St. Paul is a Greek philosopher in a way. Why? Well, because Christianity believes that God created the world ex nihilo, from nothing, right? From nothing. And then death of humans require the intervention of God to actually grant them eternal life. Well, let me be precise. Of course, eternal life could be a hell too, but the resurrection of the bodies, for instance, is granted only through direct intervention of God during a judgment day, right? So even Christianity is well within the discourse of philosophy that believes that creation comes out of nothingness, and that creation is the locus of death, is the place of corruption, decay, pain, and projects all the positive connotation of eternity into transcendence. The divine dimension is the real eternity. This life is the life of sickness and death, right? So in a way, philosophy individuates nothingness as a key element for our culture. In a way, Greek thought understands non-being as an essential difference that allows being to be, okay? For Severino, this is a problem. This is a serious problem, okay? We'll see that. All right, now the last discourse is technology. Technology, again, he says that philosophy begins with the Greek thought and ends with Hegel, more or less, and then we have modernity. But already Nietzsche was one of the thinkers that understands the importance of nothingness for modernity when he says that God is dead. Severino says God is dead means that the world has realized not only that he has no need for a transcendent, immutable being, but that such being would make man's creativity impossible, because the creation and destruction of beings is itself the immanent process of their becoming. What does Severino mean by this? If you have an omnipotent God that inhabits eternity in a transcendent dimension, if it's perfect and fully omnipotent, everything that we live through is already determined. There's no room, there's really no room for what even Christian believes to be free will. Everything has to be determined. Severino says, from the Christian God, one cannot pull the knowledge of a single breadcrumb, because if one eliminates God awareness of it, that breadcrumb ceases to exist, right? Of course, I don't want to get involved into the issue of evil. How do you justify evil if you are perfect goodness, right? But that would also prevent humanity, to create something new, which is the the key element of modernity, make it new, produce something new. So, the announcement that God is dead is instrumental to the birth of modernity, because it frees the powers of humankind. In a way, there's a reversal here, because the divine, it turns from the condition of possibility for the existence of permanence to a blockage that does not allow becoming. If becoming is truly becoming, it has to involve nothingness, non-being, and so a perfect being that is fully existent and forever will not allow nothingness. And technology then kicks in at this point as a sort of potentiation, infinite growth of creativity based on the possibility that there's nothing and then there are things. It's the full mobilization of becoming in a way. And technology, Severino says, declares that any existing limit is only factual, historical, provisional, contingent. And its apparatus can and must extend indefinitely its dominion over things and deploy its capacity, again, to do what? Well, its capacity to, by mastering becoming, actually, technology is telling you, is telling humanity, finally, we found a cure to death and decay, okay? Isn't that the myth that technology is still propagating today? Isn't that the great thing that all the industries are pursuing? The cure, the remedying, rejuvenation. You mentioned it, like it is a constant mobilization of the force of becoming so that you avoid death. But in reality, it is based on the fact that God does not exist anymore, so that there must be creation. That is to say, there must be a nothingness and then something that is produced. So Severino says, in the end, its own definition is nihilistic, because it is based on a foundation, on a founding exception, which is non-being. And it also carries great, in itself, the seed of this non-being, because it constantly produces death. Think about nuclear weapons, right? Nuclear weapons are a means in itself. They are an end in itself. They simply grow to keep on growing, because what is their real utility, usefulness? What is the usefulness if everybody has nuclear weapons, right? Militarily, you cannot win a war. Somewhere Severino says that the only thing that survived the communist experiment in Soviet Union is nuclear arsenal, which allows him to say that even communism is within this technical discourse, because it allowed the mobilization of technology to take over the destiny of society. Okay, so I hope I was clear enough to explain these three discourses, which again you can see are connected to the idea that you have to have a foundation that is either full, and if it's full and there's a God, then you cannot have real life because it's all determined. If it's empty, then you fall into the discourse of technology and the mobilization of becoming, which reproduces death and nothingness, because it's based on that same nothingness, okay? So Severino, then this is the last part of the talk, Severino then tries to elaborate on an overcoming of these three discourses, because it seems like technology is now the winning. It's almost impossible to defeat, right? If technology is about the growth of itself, everybody is actually pushed to participate in that growth, because even if you decided not to do it, then somebody else is going to do it and it can dominate you, right? And so you're pushed into, again, the nuclear war, the nuclear race is very much into his thinking. Okay, so how to overcome all these elements? Severino talks about eternity, okay, in a concept that he calls the circle of appearing, which I will try to explain. Becoming and progression is due, we said, to nothingness. You need to find a way to get rid of that nothingness. His solution is to depict a universe in which every instant is eternal. Everything is eternal in its moment. Now, that's the good news. I'm telling you. Am I telling you never die? No. Is Severino telling us we never die? No, because he died in 2020. Is he still alive? He's dead, right? What does he mean by that? To quote Alessandro Carrera, who worked on Severino, one of the few in the United States who worked on Severino, he says, the eternity that Severino speaks does not mean that the empirical you and I are immortal in time. Eternity is not immortality, but that each moment, every slice of reality is eternal. The truth constitutes itself insofar as appearing itself belongs to the being that appears. Every instant appears to be, and as it appears is eternal, not immortal, but eternal, okay? What does he mean by that? It's not without, he said, we will never be able to invent a time machine to go back to the past, because there is no place for the past. Everything keeps on existing in its connection and its punctuality, but you cannot go to that place because it's not a place. And it's not time, because it's timeless too. I know that Severino always says this is a scandalous thought. Most of the people say this is great. I don't understand what you're saying. Well, why would go against? Why would you go against evidence? Okay. Well, but if you read contemporary theoretical physicists, and they would tell you that time is not a variant when you get to the subatomic level of physics. Time does not exist. They cannot really use it. Time is a measuring of movement, but who is measuring? And that's the other problem, right? So it's time. We have to sort of depart from that idea that time is a Newtonian concept. A Newtonian concept that is absolute, is a dimension that is disconnected from space. Now, let's see, how much time do I have left? Let me try to clarify this point by perhaps bringing in some examples. These ideas they echo psychoanalysis too. So you know that in the unconscious there is really no time. It's a timeless dimension. So that'd be another entry point into this thought. But let's take the example of perhaps two parents who are talking to their child, and the child is looking at a picture where she's not in the picture because she was not born, right? So the child says, "Where was I back then?" And the parent, if the parent studies a little bit of philosophy, will be a little bit in a pickle, and because he or she has to say, well, you didn't exist back then, right? You didn't exist back then. Now the child, I think, most cases would react with stupor, with a kind of an astonished reaction. How is it possible that my being is non-being? That's the reaction of their look. How is it possible that my being is non-existent, was not existent? How is it possible that being is not being? Because the child is viscerally attached to life, where being is predicated on being, on existing. It is impossible to think a being that is not being, right? And even the parent, I think even the parent should feel some logical discomfort, because it would negate, it would demolish their own identity as a parent. And this goes back to a non-progressive linearity, because who is that produces the child? The parent. But who is that produces the parent? It's the child, which is it's an illogical, there's no progression, like there's no chronological progression, but in logical terms, the parent is produced by the child. Now, by saying that you were a non-being, then you are also affecting your own identity. So this goes, a little bit to explain what Severino means by the eternity of instance. It's a network of connection that has always existed and will always be there. And if you negate it, it creates problem because of all the relations that he has with the before and an after. So now the problem is, okay, but becoming happens. Like, it's not that we're frozen into immobility. Things move, things happen, right? So how do you explain movement? How do you explain what he calls variation? Variation for Severino is, in this case, Einstein can help us a little bit, because he quotes him, even though he's in disagreement with the theory of relativity, but still he quotes Einstein and says, look, Einstein at a certain point, when he was trying to picture the universe, he said we should picture the universe as a roll of film where every instant has happened. And then we have a camera, we have a light that illuminates that moment. Severino says something similar, that every instant exists eternally, but it's appearing that fades away in certain moments. So he creates a mechanism according to which he calls it the circle of appearing, illuminates something comes to life, something emerges, and that's being, and then something else happens. But what is not illuminated anymore does not go anywhere, is still there. There's no, however, I mean, he's not thinking about providence, he's not thinking about some scientific version of a God who produces a mechanism. It's completely non-intentional, okay? There's no intentionality in it. Reality emerges, something comes forth, and then recedes into the background. I mean, in a way, I think you can picture it if you think about our universe from a very long distance, at the threshold of its end. Everything, the light that we emit, must have been stored there, as in a film, and that light keeps on existing because it travels. It does not dissipate. Why? The last point I want to make is why is he so concerned with the idea of non-being? Why? Because this is the real problem. Like for Severino, somehow believing that things start from nothing and then go back into nothing is the folly, is the madness of our civilization, and it's the madness that is driving also technology. Okay, so how does he explain that non-being is impossible, is logically impossible? To explain this, let me use an example that Ludwig Wittgenstein actually used in his notebooks, 1914, 1916. He asked a very interesting question. How can you negate a picture? Okay, so for instance, how can you put in a picture, how can you depict the fact that it does not rain? Easy, you say, well, just draw a picture of a sunny landscape. Well, actually, the picture of Wittgenstein says two puppets fencing would deny rain as well, because it's non-rain, right? What does he mean by that? That non-being, non-negative facts do not exist, are a logical impossibility. Negation exists. Negation is an operation that is crafted on reality, on being, but it does not produce the non-being of that being. It simply adds a layer to it. Negation is not a fact, but an operation. It reverses the sense of a proposition. Negation sometimes actually produces differences. It says not non-A, so that means C, D, F, G, 2, 2, 2. It produces being, but it does not show us non-being. And that's the connection between Wittgenstein and Severino. Severino himself says that non-being is a fallacy. This is sometimes called the golden implication of Severino's argument, that non-being does not really exist because simply it is a misrepresentation of how negation works. Negation produces being, as I just said. It does not show you non-being. So nothingness does not exist. Nothingness cannot exist. If you then take this concept into the dimension of time, then you can see that there cannot be an external point from a temporality that has an origin and an end. And you cannot also say that there is a becoming that produces a becoming other of the other. But you have to admit, according to Severino, that every instant is eternal, that everything in its instantaneity glimmers, appears, and thus glimmers forever in its immanence, in a way. All possibility, he talks about the totality of facts, the totality of possibilities. They must be eternal and instantaneous. The instant, in fact, an instant is beyond time, is not part of time. Otherwise, you would measure it, right? It's the limit point of time, but according to Severino, is the real temporal dimension, eternity, eternal. An instant does not vanish for Severino, but persist in its eternity. So the idea is that that according to this philosophy, we can start to think about a dimension of time that knows no progression and thus no foundation from the outside, in no gap in between, but that simply pops up and persists. However, as it looks like modern physics is showing us, where you don't have time as a variant, you don't have cause and effect as well, you don't even have locality, because certain molecules can be in two places at the same time. All right, so all that, our what Kant would call the transcendental categories that help us organize our life would not really apply at that level. I hope that I want to leave it to this now. I hope it was clear enough. But let's maybe give time soon to questions or comments.
Right. Thank you, Andrea.